Thank you, Senator Ossoff. At this point, I believe it's my turn to hold a virtual gavel here for a minute and proceed with my questions. I want to thank all the witnesses again for your participation today. A couple of issues I want to touch on, beginning with the myth of voter fraud. Voter fraud, if you look at the data, is exceedingly rare in the United States. And yet this data that I looked at repeatedly in my prior capacity as California Secretary of State. So I'll say it again. Voter fraud is exceedingly rare in the United States. In election after election, including the November 2020 election, we see little evidence of the massive or widespread voter fraud that some political figures would want you to believe and be afraid of. Nonetheless, this myth of voter fraud is used as a pretext to suggest and pass unnecessary voting measures or changes to election laws whose only real effect is to make it harder for eligible voters, particularly minority voters, to cast a ballot. Some of us have recognized that already in this hearing. My first question is to Mr. Sines. If you can continue to expand on how this myth of voter fraud is weaponized against increasingly ascendant minority communities in particular. The country is only becoming more diverse by the day, and I'd like for us to focus on creating as an inclusive democracy as possible, not less so. Mr. Sines.
Absolutely. The mythology around voter fraud is used by its constant repetition, despite no evidence of anything other than isolated and often inadvertent voter fraud in the form of those who are not eligible actually casting a ballot. Isolated instances, often inadvertent. And the other form of voter fraud that is a myth and put out there is the notion of voter intimidation. Precious little evidence of any voter intimidation where someone is coerced into voting against their actual views doesn't happen, but that's often weaponized against remote voting. But what happens is the myth of voter fraud becomes an imperative to act to protect election integrity, even if elections really have a great deal of integrity already. And so you see the enactment, as in Georgia, as in Texas, of new measures that make it more complicated to vote. And as you know, that has a particular effect on newer voters, whether they're newer because they've just decided to register or they just became eligible through naturalization or age eligible to vote. But for newer voters and often for longtime voters who are elderly, these complicating factors do not facilitate participation. They actually deter and in some cases prevent participation. And that's where we see the discriminatory effects. And it in turn goes back to why we often see racially discriminatory intent, because there is an understanding that some of these measures will in fact have their greatest impact on minority voting communities.
Okay. And back to the myth of voter fraud, fact versus fiction or myth versus data. In this hearing, we heard a lot of back and forth about voter ID, the role of voter ID, the fact that many states have a voter ID law. Is there any data that you can point us to that suggests voter ID is actually a solution to a problem, or is it a solution in search of a problem? Does voter ID do more good in preventing voter fraud or more bad in terms of making it harder for eligible people to vote or actually disenfranchise eligible voters from participating?
Well, the fact is it's hard to demonstrate any impact because there is no evidence of significant voter fraud. So it is a problem that doesn't exist. So how do you demonstrate that you're actually addressing it? I will point out that anyone who's really interested in engaging in fraudulent voting and ineligible voter can very easily obtain a fraudulent ID. It's not hard. I mean, that's why these examples given by Senator Lee really are not relevant, because we see fraud in those circumstances, whether it's at a bar, as he suggested, or in accessing benefits. We see fraud using fraudulent ID in those circumstances. So it's absolutely unclear that voter ID has any effect other than to make it more difficult, often involving cost and time, for those to obtain a voter ID that they've never had before, because usually where it's had its most pernicious impact, the limits on what IDs are acceptable is critical. I again point out Senator Lee used school IDs as an example, and yet school IDs in the state of Texas are not allowed as a voter ID. So that's the kind of problems that we see. There's really no match between non-existent voter fraud and what voter ID is intended to do.
But your concealed weapons permit is allowed in Texas. So there you go. Next question is for both Mr. Yang and Professor Tolson. We've talked during the course of the hearing about the geographic-based approach versus the practice-based approach under the formula for the Voting Rights Act. We know that it covers certain jurisdictions who since then, or over the last 55 years, certainly since 2013, have experienced significant demographic change, but there's also non-covered jurisdictions where Asian American community, Latino community, African American community, others are continuing to diversify those populations. Can you just shed a little bit more light on the nuance between previously covered versus non-covered and the significance of geographic-based versus practice-based protections here?
Well, one of the beauties of practice-based coverage is that it avoids some of the stigma that the Supreme Court talked about in Shelby County with respect to suggesting that certain states fall under stigma by falling under the geographic provisions. Here, under practice-based coverage, we are looking at historic practices that have been used to disenfranchise essentially communities of color. We should say all vulnerable voters, but it really has been more on communities of color. And so by focusing there with some precision as to what practices we are talking about, we add a layer of coverage that would give protection to those communities that are emerging in places that have historically not seen minority voters.
I don't have much to add, but I will point out that one of the benefits of having practice-based coverage is that it's significantly more tailored than Section 4B was in its original form, because it focuses on specific practices and also picks a demographic threshold that is really important, because it's really at a point where minority communities are starting to reach numbers where they can influence the outcome of an election. And then that coupled with some geographic coverage, which would allow the statute to get at voting rights violators. Having geographic coverage and practice-based preclearance together in a way that effectively addresses the concerns raised by the court in Shelby County is a much tailored, narrowly tailored and better way to approach the issue of voting rights violations now.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Chair, before I turn it back over, just want to, more of a comment, not really a question, but to lay a marker for an issue that I'd love to work with you on going forward. And that is this: we've discussed voter ID, how it's problematic. We've, in practice, become familiar with sometimes it's not an exact name match, how it appears in the voter registration rolls versus an ID, particularly in the Latino community, when sometimes you have multiple last names. Sometimes government administrators will erroneously shift one of your last names to your middle name, et cetera, those sorts of things. We've talked about language issues and the role of better training for poll workers, for example, to better serve language minorities who are citizens of age, registered to vote, eligible, but sometimes face barriers to voter participation. I know in California, we've been working with advocacy organizations to provide better training for poll workers to better serve the LGBTQ community, particularly trans voters, eligible voters, citizens who may not present themselves in person when coming to vote in the same way they may appear on a voter registration roll or even on their ID when showing up to vote in a voter ID state. So some research to be done there, some best practices to research, and we'd love to bring forward some opportunities to buttress that nationally, not just in California.